Hello everyone and welcome to my channel and my very first video. Today I'm going to be converting a miniature for Necropolis. The base mini I'm using is from A Song of Ice and Fire miniatures. This one is Maester Windmere, or just Windmere, I'm not entirely sure, but he's from the first set of House Greyjoy heroes. The conversion for the head is actually really simple. This is just a box of skull from Citadel. Some would argue the best kit they've ever made. I rolled out some green stuff, kind of like in a tube shape, and made the scarf. And used a tool to flatten it out a little bit and give it a little more shape. I did the same for the head wrap. I didn't really do any kind of research to figure out how they're properly wrapped. It mostly just sits on top and kind of folds over itself. The first thing we're going to go over is creating this staff. My process for creating miniatures, or creating characters rather, for Necropolis is usually just lop the head off and stick a skull on it. I find that works perfectly well, and especially when using miniatures from this range, just because the poses are so great, the detail is fantastic. So this is 26 gauge fluorescent wire. There's 250 feet of it in this roll, and let me tell you, this stuff is going to last a while. I've used it for a couple different things, mainly trees, but in this case I wanted to use it to make this staff. So I unroll a little length of it, cut it with these very old cutters. Yeah, very old cutters. But they've served me well, so I'm going to keep using them. I fold the fluorescent wire a couple times, and then I cut through this loop at the end, which I won't be needing. This larger loop is where I'm going to start twisting it into shape, but the other loop I can cut out. And I edited this part out because you don't need to see me struggle again with these clippers. So obviously I've already made a staff, but as you'll see in this video, I like how the second staff comes out better, so I end up using that one anyway. I twist the length of the wire to get an even twist. In retrospect, I probably could have put some kinks in there somewhere to make it look more like a branch modeled into a staff, but the result is fine. The loop at the end is going to get cut off, and I probably could have saved some of this, but it's not necessary. I ended up throwing most of it away. Now these clippers are absolutely not going to have a fun time cutting through all of this, so I'm going to pull out something else. This guy. Now this thing is not going to break a sweat at all, cutting through 4 layers of fluorescent wire. Yeah, not a problem. The reason I have this is because I use it for cutting brass rod, so I can mount my busts to a plinth, and it doesn't really struggle with that either. So you can see how I cut the staff to fit. Just a little quick comparison so I know where to cut, and then super glue it into place. Now that I've primed the miniature using Citadel Chaos Black, which works fine for my purposes, but by all means use whatever you like, I go back and use Pro Acryl Black, which dries flat, which is why I like it, to cover up any spots that I missed, maybe give another layer to certain parts. Reason being is because this is made with brightly colored plastic, and I don't want that showing through. If anything's going to show through, I'd rather it be black paint as opposed to a really bright green color. I don't quite get everything in this pass, but by the end it's all covered up and you're not going to notice it, particularly on the inside of the right forearm there. Now this first color is pure Iroko, and the progression for this is going to be Iroko with some soul yellow, and I don't really have a ratio. I kind of just add it until I see that it's lightened up, and mainly I focus on the upward faces. I won't go too into detail about the colors that I use or why I use them. I don't picture these to be instructional videos. Mainly, it's more about the process and my thinking when I paint. And hopefully that inspires your work as well. I have certainly been inspired by other painters. I kind of like to just share what I've learned from others, but also on my own through developing my own style. Now the skull is painted Mars orange, and I figure, why stick to the classic bone colors? Why not an orange skull, right? I've already painted a red one. My next one's probably going to be some shade of blue. So let's do it. Mars orange. I add a little bit of soul yellow to this as well to brighten it up, mainly because I want to get the cheekbone, the brow, the bridge of the nose. It doesn't come across too well on the camera, but I certainly noticed it when I painted it. I thought I would come back to this and add more highlights but I was pretty happy with the end result and I ended up leaving it alone. For the scarf, I started with Arabic Shadow. In the first couple layers, I wasn't too worried about how I was applying it, because I knew that subsequent layers would cover over it. The orange would go over the yellow, no problem, and this Arabic Shadow would go over the orange, no problem. But as I work my way down, I'm a little more careful about how I apply the colors. And I don't want to leave any black in the recesses, because I want my shaded areas to be a dark version of my main color, if that makes sense. I don't want to have pure black in the recesses. It creates kind of a boundary or border. So I'll put in the main color and then highlight from there. Here I just add Iroko to the Arabic Shadow to lighten it up some, mainly focusing on the upward faces. You can see that the bottom quarter or so of the scarf isn't painted, and I mostly worry about the top. These colors have a lot of vibrancy right off of the palette and right onto the model. But once it dries, the vibrancy goes away and it's not as saturated, but that's true of all paints, really. Again, mostly worrying about the upward faces. Mostly focused on that. The last bit with Soul Yellow as well. And the volumes get smaller and smaller as I continue. A quick aside, this is a really crappy brush. I don't know how much it costs. I think I got these for $50 for $7. But once they've served their purpose here, they're going to become terrain brushes or dry brushes, or they're going to become terrain themselves. I don't know. I save my sable brushes for the harder, finer work. Now the cape is being painted with brown leather, and that's going to be my base coat. It's actually going to end up being kind of my mid-tone. The colors I use for this are brown leather, black leather to darken it up, a tiny bit of pure black just to get it even further across that line. Now once I've sorted out my mid-tone and my shadows, I progressively add Kalahari orange to that mix until I'm essentially painting with pure Kalahari orange. These first few layers go pretty quickly. I'm not thinning these paints at all. They're just coming straight out of the bottle onto the wet palette. So the thing about this this skirt, or this tunic, I mixed in Indian Shadow and black leather. Not sure what the result was going to be. The end result kind of looks a lot like a lighter, maybe more desaturated red leather. I probably could have saved myself a lot of time if I used red leather, but here we are. I follow a lot of amazing painters on YouTube, and one thing I notice about all of them is how quickly they maneuver that brush. Just the confidence and the speed in the application, and I'd like to get there someday. So using cheap synthetic brushes not only saves my sable brushes, it also allows me to practice my speed without worrying about ruining a brush that's $20 on the cheap side. It allows me to kind of manipulate it in ways that I normally wouldn't manipulate a sable brush, like stabbing in between these rings or forcing the bristles upwards. You know, the brush is being used the way it's meant to be used, like any other tool. Now this volume that I'm painting in here is pure Indian Shadow, and my thinking was applying a wet layer of the mix that I used before, and then a wet layer of Indian Shadow, and trying to move the colors across each other to wet blend them. And if you've watched any Bob Ross in the past, you'll know that he does that quite a bit with his paintings. That's how he starts his paintings a lot. He does wet on wet blending. And it's kind of the same idea here with applying a wet layer down, putting another layer on top, and moving it around. One thing I'll mention is that I am not trying to paint to the highest standard or the best that I can. I'm trying to paint a mood. I don't really know quite how to explain it. I would say I'm painting to how I interpret the blend shitsu or grimdark style to be for my tastes, or what I enjoy the most about it. If you're not familiar with blend shitsu or the grimdark style, I'd recommend looking up those hashtags on social media. There's so many incredible creators to follow that have mastered this style in their own way. John Blanche, of course, being one of them. Look up the online magazines from 28 Mag. They're up to 5 volumes, and they're just filled with the most inspirational stuff. And I say inspirational because it's the kind of art that I enjoy within the miniature space. It might not be for everyone at first, but I think if you look at it and it speaks to you and it just kind of catches your eye and you have that moment where you think, yeah, I get it, then it just opens up so many new styles and topics, subject matter, techniques that you might not have tried before. And I like to think I'm a pretty good painter. I've got some miniatures on my social media that I'm very, very proud of. But something about trying to paint in this grimdark style, or what I interpreted the grimdark style to be, has been so liberating, and it's really, really reinvigorated my love for the hobby. Not just the painting side, but also the converting, the terrain building, all of that. And I suppose that's really what this channel is about for me. It's rediscovering that and exploring that. I don't really intend for it to be instructional, but if you get anything out of it, then that's fantastic. I'm happy to share what I've learned. And if not, at least join me on my journey as I explore this and learn more about myself. Now here I'm painting in the shadows using a darker mix of the cape before. I'm literally using the lamp that I have overhead to paint into the shadows. It kind of creates a hard line of where the shadows are. But once I start building texture, you know, that hard line kind of goes away and it blends a little better. So with the mid-tone mix that I had before, I'm adding Kalahari Orange. And at first, I was painting the edge because I just wanted to see how the color looks on the Mini. But once I got some volumes down, then I started to go a little harder. Again, I'm not really worried about painting as neatly as possible. I'm trying to capture a mood that I like, a feeling that I like, and a lot of that just means a little bit of overrun. Now once I've got most of the paint off my brush, I start, dry brushing essentially, stabbing at the model, picking out certain volumes. I accidentally paint the shoulder here, but as Bob Ross would say, happy accidents. So this brush is getting its ass kicked, as you can tell. It is getting beat to hell, but all in service of this Mini. So what I'm trying to achieve is texture, but not just visual texture, where you can see the worn down cloak. I also want to build physical texture. I think if you were to build enough of it and you rub your finger across it, you'll feel that there is pigment deposited on the cape. And if you could feel that texture, chances are it's going to come across visually as well. Very impactful, let's say. I could probably mess with this all day and just keep going back with lighter and lighter colors, but at some point I have to stop. But you do you. Go as far as you want. Achieve that mood that you're after. This is just pure Kalahari Orange at this point. If it seems like there's a lot of focus on the cape, That's because there is. It ended up being my favorite part of the mini, or one of the favorite parts. I really enjoy everything about it, but I was very proud of how the cape turned out. So the front needed some love too, and I took the previous mixture that I had for the tunic and lined it up some. I think this was soul yellow, it might just be white as well. But again, not looking for the cleanest highlights, just picking out spots that I think might make texture and might look interesting visually. You see I go back and forth a lot. I try not to settle in one spot. I like to move around some and kind of make decisions on the fly. So the bird's going to be really simple. Because I want to use a contrast paint and replicate a progression that I used on a ghost model that I've already painted before, I'm just going to base coat it white. And this is Pro Acryl white, so it'll dry flat. And because it dries flat, it makes a better surface for contrast paints, because it won't run as easily as if you were painting over a glossy surface. But I'll talk more about that once we get back to it. Right now, this is just a base coat. So here, this is just black leather, just trying to get a good base coat. I'm not too worried about the shade because it is such a dark color as it is. And I'll let the highlights do the work as far as inferring where the shadows are. This is just pure brown leather. The black leather was darkened a little bit with black, but this is pure brown leather, and I pick out the points of the boots, the bottom of the cuffs, and after I clean off my brush, I move it around a little bit. I follow basically the same step on the gloves, and now that I look at this model, I'm pretty sure that's just a cuffed sleeve and a bare hand. But that's fine because I don't have to figure out what a hand might look like on a model that has a skull for a head. So they're just regular gloves, that's fine. And this kind of looks like a falconer's glove, which is I guess how you would handle these birds. Or the safe way to handle these birds at least. But the same colors I used for the boots. And then come back with a big volume of brown leather. And more of the going back and forth. I throw some brown leather on the boots again, just to build up on the brown leather that I'd already put down before. For the bird, I used Citadel's Pilar Glacier contrast paint. I had it on my wet palette, which I normally wouldn't do, but because there was going to be so little of this, I went ahead and did it anyway, just to not have to use a dry palette. The reason I normally don't put it on a wet palette is because I don't want to get any more water into the contrast paint and change its properties even slightly. I try to be selective with where I place it, but at the same time I also am totally fine adding more and more and more and moving it around. I don't really know if this read as a spectral bird. I think if I had painted a glow around the hands it would have. I shared a picture with somebody and they thought it was just a white bird. I suppose I should have painted the beak at that point. So here's a moment where I was thinking about the character itself and not so much the process when I was painting. I want this character to reside in the Eternal Autumn, which is a setting within Necropolis. And I'd made a board for that setting specifically, so I was thinking, should I paint this as a birch tree? I felt that that might take away a little too much from the white bird, so I went with a brown color instead. Now, as I paint this, I was thinking to myself, I should have put some super glue on the staff itself, just kind of douse it in super glue to fill in some gaps, and so that it doesn't just look like twisted wire, right? I could have done that. I could have also dotted a couple spots with latex rubber, which is how I make my trees, again, to fill up some of these gaps, fill up some of these spots, smooth it out a little bit. But the result is still pretty good. It looks like bramble, it looks like maybe vines. You don't really have to answer those questions. Leave open-ended questions. Don't have to answer everything. So I used boreal green for the front of the staff because I wanted there to be some difference in color between the front and the back. I flooded the front with Warrior Green, and then I started moving around the color to force it into the recesses, but also mainly to get it away from the top, or the outside faces, I guess, of the florist wire. I'm kind of rebuilding what I did before using brown leather. I guess what I was going for was to have the top of the staff be a little more mossy, kind of giving it like a magical appearance. There's a pretty clear difference between the front and the back of the staff. But I'm going to tie this all together with a couple different colors. So again, back to the browns, adding a little bit of Iroko. And having that kind of color on top, going across the whole staff, helps sell the blend a little better. So all the colors that come next are going to be a little more specific. It looks like a dry brush, but I'm really just trying to pick out certain spots. I'm not trying to go all over the staff again. So the bag, or the satchel, I wanted another pop of color besides just the yellow. So I mixed some scale 75 deep red with brown leather for my base coat, and more thoughts about the character. You know, is it a scholar? Is it a traveler? You know, what do they have in the bag? Are they indexing what they come across in the forests in the eternal autumn? Are they taking flowers or herbal specimens? You know, now that I think about it out loud, it probably would have been fun to have some stuff sticking out of the bag. I think that would have really sold the effect. I'm not one to really go back to models after they're done, but I may just do it for this one because this one has been a lot of fun to work on. So pure deep red, just because I wanted it to be brighter. I think it shows up a little brighter on camera, but that could also be just because it's fresh paint, and fresh paint is always going to have a little more saturation. Well, a lot more saturation, actually. Once it dries, it'll calm down, come back to earth. This is pure brown leather, and like I did with the cape, I wanted to paint this directly into the shadows. I don't think you're ever going to see the bottom of the satchel, but I'll know it's there, so I paint it in. Now I gotta paint the shirt. I want to differentiate the different fabrics, the different cloth that's being used here, whether it's wool, cotton, leather, whatever. So I wanted to go with a different color here. And like with the satchel, the color I wanted to use is going to be my mid-tone, so the base coat is going to be a darker version of that mid-tone. I try not to add black as a way to darken a color down. I try to go with a darker brown or something close to it because I don't want to lose any saturation on these colors. And with some colors especially, adding black just does weird things to it. I think we've all seen what happens when you first try to darken a yellow, right, with black. It just makes a weird green. And the nice thing about painting fabric like this, where it's all wrinkled up, is that you kind of have a really good guide already about where your highlights and your midtones should go. I'm not painting into the bottoms of the folds, I'm just focused on the top. Looking up close, all these volumes and shapes kind of just look like blobs. But from a tabletop distance, they'll read more coherently. I often get way too caught up looking at close-ups of my models, and sometimes I'll see, especially on this buckle here coming up, that paint has overrun it in one place, and I see that and it just really burns my toast. It drives me a little crazy that I wasn't neater or that I didn't spot it, but then I remind myself that our eyes don't have that kind of zoom level, so it's okay to let a couple mistakes go. Ooh, sorry about the color temperature change. I clearly hit my lamp without realizing it. Now for the finer details like the chains on the front, I'm using one of my sable brushes just because it holds a point very well and it'll help me apply the metallics more carefully. I'm always as careful as I can be with metallics just because if I paint them the way I have been the other colors from before, I can really lose control and paint something I don't want to paint, and at this stage going back and fixing that can be a little difficult, so I play it safe. Now here's where I try to paint the belt, and I'm sorry about the focusing issues. I'm using my phone as a camera. But I try to paint this belt, and when I look at it up close later on, I realized that there was a little bit of overbrushing, but I couldn't really tell when I was doing this. I'm not too worried about it. If I worried about every kind of mistake that I made like this on a miniature, I'd never finish one. So the buttons are Victorian brass, just because I don't use Victorian brass very often. The buckle was black metal, the chains were decayed metal. These are all scale 75. I absolutely love their metals. So this is probably the first color that I ever bought from the scale 75 range, and it's Caribbean blue. I thinned this down really thin, but not quite to a glazed consistency. I still want some body in it. And I'm essentially just painting directly over what I did earlier, hoping that it'll go into the recesses. I'm mainly trying to touch the brush to the model to kind of break surface tension so the paint will flow. And when I'm doing something like this, I always keep a clean brush on hand so I can easily suck up all the excess paint, especially when it's like a wash. I don't go back to redo the metal because I like the dulling effect that the wash has over it. So basing. Now this is something that I learned from watching Sam Lenz, the way he does his bases often, which is to slap some paint on it, throw another paint next to it, and just wet blend them. And if you've ever wanted to learn how to wet blend or practice your wet blending, I always do it on my bases like this. Going by Sam Lenz's teachings, you can have an easier time wet blending stuff when you put it on a textured surface, and a base is a good example of that. The colors I'm using are Gobi Brown, Dubai Brown, and Eclipse Gray. So I'm going to put these two colors next to each other and then kind of just sweep them into each other to achieve that blend. You'll see I get like the middle color there as I move it around. Use the Eclipse Gray next to the Dubai Brown. And again, no thinning, just straight from the wet palette onto the base and moving it around so it blends. This brush has been through hell and back, but it's really helped me produce a mini that I love. I want to talk a little bit more about the game that this character is intended for. And I call them characters because I want these characters to have a history before the game existed, and therefore they can have a future during campaign play or any one-off games I have. Necropolis is a 28mm skirmish game created by Owlshield. The rules are free, the Discord is free to join, and it's such an incredible community on there. Not just a lot of nice, helpful people, but also a lot of inspiration. Everyone's got their own interpretation of what Necropolis is, and it's so fun seeing that come together. I really like the small form factor of Necropolis. The board is meant to be 16 inches by 16 inches, which is great for me because I live in an apartment, so space is a premium. and it's called the Diorama Skirmish game, and the pictures that I've seen of other people playing it certainly live up to that name. And Necropolis has been such an inspiration for me to get into this style of building miniatures and painting miniatures with the terms grimdark and blenshitsu on my mind. I've always looked for a way into this side of the hobby, and I have a lot of love for a lot of the bigger games, you know, every iteration of Warhammer, for instance. But there's something so interesting and challenging to me about painting miniatures like this that I'm so glad I could finally get into it. And so for me, that game was Necropolis. If you have any interest in getting into this style of painting or approach to painting, creating, converting miniatures, look into the 28 community, because there's bound to be something that's going to inspire you. Now, to tie everything together, I used a dry brush of Gobi Brown. Not doing 100% dry brush on everything, just kind of melding a couple of colors together. If you want to do a wash, you could. I opted not to, mainly because I didn't want to wait for the wash to dry. So now onto the tufts. I wanted to use these orange flowers because there's orange flowers on my Eternal Autumn board. But then I got these other tufts that are supposed to be like a dead fall setting, and all the colors seem to be good for that theme. Now I'm using tweezers, and I do apply a dab of super glue to the end of the tufts, and I use the tweezers because they're finicky and they make me feel like a scientician, but it really does help me apply these, especially if there's a lot going on with the model. I'm also using the business end of these tweezers to try to pick out any straggling bits of flock. Now I thought about adding these to the base, but then I pulled out these, which look a lot more interesting to me. Just so it's not another little tuft of grass, just a different color. These have little bits that almost look like leaves on top, and I guess it kind of looks like watercress, but hey, it's another interesting texture to add to the base. Now watch me ruin all the work that I did earlier, blending all these colors together. You can omit this step, but I include it, and I think I'm trying to cope with losing a lot of work that I did before, but I know the colors are there from the base, so in my mind I guess I can still see them through the weathering powder, but I like the effect that the weathering powder gives, especially if I can get it onto the model itself, like make the bottom of the cloak dusty or the boots dusty. I like that effect, so I go for it anyway, whether I lose the color of the base or not. So now I've got a knowledge cube and a very old piece of sticky tack. You can see some of the primer on it. I'm just going to use this until it stops being sticky. And for my base rims, I use Scale Color Artist acrylics because they come in a tube and it makes me feel really fancy. I've been using this thing for so many minis at this point that for me it's just a question of consistency also. But it makes me feel fancier for using one of these tubes, so I'm going to do it. Whatever little joy I can pry out of every aspect of painting, I will do it. Now because this is a heavier body acrylic, I do thin it down just a little bit, not to where it acts like the other paints in the Scale 75 line, just enough to break down some of the body of this heavy body acrylic. Now it does require 2 coats. This is the last step. It's probably the most satisfying, oddly enough, getting that lick of paint around the whole base rim. But I went a little slow because I was kind of a little sad that it was over. And yeah, that's my latest character for Necropolis. I ended up naming her Lucinda after Lucinda Williams. And I've got so many ideas for future projects and potentially future videos. I hope you enjoyed. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I hope to see you in the next one. Happy painting, y'all.